I want to get to this story. We talked a couple of days ago about something I'd never heard. I'd not heard this term before. It is called a lost Canadian. And apparently there are thousands of people who find themselves in this situation right now. Melanie Barton is a New York Times best-selling author. You may know her if you read books as Julia Kent. She's one of those people caught in that situation right now, and she is on the line. Melanie, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
I know we started talking about this. We got cut off the other day. So I want you to just explain the situation you find yourself in. And as I said, it's not unique. I keep hearing, we had a gentleman on the other day saying literally there are thousands of people finding themselves in this situation. So what is a lost Canadian, and what have you been going through trying to get back to Canada?
All right. A lost Canadian is someone who has a parent, a grandparent, a great-grandparent who could not pass their citizenship on to a child or a grandchild, et cetera, born outside of Canada. And so I've been working toward claiming my Canadian citizenship for quite some time. It didn't just start with the new administration here in the United States. It started a long time ago, and so there are different kinds of lost Canadians, but many of us have been trying for years. I've known my whole life that both sides of my family were Canadian. My grandfather, Walter Barton, was from Rock Creek, BC. He emigrated here to the U.S., largely driven by poverty, found a job, married, had kids. And then my mother's side, they're all from Point Edward, Ontario, but ended up in Port Huron, Michigan. And so, in my grandfather's case, on my mother's side, some of the siblings were born in Point Edward, some were born in Port Huron. And so it's just a river and an international border dividing the family. But I've known my entire life, and I've been working. So in the early 2000s, I worked for a Canadian company. Then I began publishing fiction, and I started to come to Canada more and more, and started researching whether I could claim my citizenship. And my timing was off because I looked into it right after the 2009 law that established what's called the first generation limit. And when you talk about lost Canadians, you hear that term a lot, first generation limit. And so the ability to pass on Canadian citizenship ends with the first generation born outside of Canada, with very rare exceptions. I tried in 2015, I tried in 2020, I hired lawyers in Toronto to pay them for consultations and legal analysis, and the answer was always no. And then for lost Canadians, the December 2023 Bjorkquist decision that was handled by Justice Akbar Ali in the Ontario Supreme Court declared that the first generation limit was unconstitutional. And so lost Canadians now find ourselves in this limbo state because the Bjorkquist decision says first generation limit is unconstitutional, but Justice Akbar Ali gave Parliament the opportunity to do what it should do, which is legislate and pass a law defining all of this. And now 17 months later, we're still in limbo.
And I'm guessing part of that goes to the fact that Parliament is not sitting, right? We have a prorogued Parliament now, so nothing is going to happen.
Right. There's been a lot going on, certainly in Canadian politics, and then there's everything going on in the United States that affects Canadian politics. But yes, the limbo nonetheless stands for those of us who have these rights but can't exercise them, or do we? In other words, we're in limbo, literally.
Is your fear that if you were to try to come to Canada, you get turned back?
Well, I wouldn't call it so much fear as I have a business. So I have a small publishing company. And in order to move my small publishing company to Canada as a non-citizen, the current wait time is between 40 and 48 months. And I have minor children who need to be enrolled in school. I have adult children who have, we want to have connections to them. And the bottom line is that according to the Bjorkquist decision, we're Canadians.
You have a particular issue here as well. You said this happened before Donald Trump became president yet again, but this goes back to his first term. What was your rationale then? Were you worried, and are you still worried now based on your situation?
So I'm more worried now. In the and this is public from the Globe and Mail article that Marie Wolf wrote the other day, my oldest child is transgender. And so while I have been trying to reclaim citizenship since 2009, there's certainly more urgency to it now. And IRCC allows people like us, Lost Canadians, to apply and use something called urgent processing. And that means that if anyone who applies falls into a category where they might be harmed, whether it's economically or personally. So, for instance, if you're experiencing any sort of transphobia, homophobia, racial discrimination, if you may risk losing a job or have business development loss, then you can apply. There's a very specific set of criteria that IRCC established under what's called interim measures. And so many people in the United States or other countries who are trying to reclaim their Canadian citizenship, who are in the LGBTQ plus community, are applying, and many people who are experiencing racial and religious discrimination as well are doing so. So there are ways to do this, but the urgency is definitely significantly greater now that the U.S. administration is making decisions to essentially take away rights from trans and gay people.
I asked Marc Miller, who was Canada's former immigration minister. When we first spoke, I said, I'll try to find out something for you. He's been gracious enough to come in and try to explain what's going on, because even though Parliament is pro-rogue, as you said, this has been something that's been going on for a while. So thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it. You heard her story. Where are we on this, and what will change when there's a new government in place?
So this has a long history to it, and you heard from Don Chapman a couple of days ago on your show about the whole history behind the Citizenship Act and some of the discriminatory aspects of the Act. And indeed, there are so many variants of it where Canadians have become so-called lost. And this has been repaired in sort of a piecemeal fashion throughout our history. The latest decision that the author referred to, this decision that I was presented with when I became the immigration minister, was called Bjorkquist, by the name of the person who was one of the complainants, basically said that if you were born outside Canada, you could not pass your citizenship on to your progeny. Okay. So take the example of my kids who were born in the United States and in Sweden. If they were to have kids outside of Canada, they could not pass that on to them. And that was the law that Stephen Harper put into place in 2009 after the evacuation of Lebanon. And there was a whole debate about, in relation to the cost of evacuating people in Lebanon that were Canadian citizens, and the accusation that they were Canadians of convenience. Well, the court said that law was unconstitutional. So I was presented with this set of facts, didn't appeal it. But what the court didn't, because it didn't make sense, and I don't think we had a prospect of winning, but what the court said is that they would suspend the application of the judgment, Aaron, until we put forward legislation that made sense. Let's understand that not everyone can become Canadian, and you can't sit in the US or Brazil or in France and pass Canadian citizenship on with zero connection to Canada ad nauseum from generation to generation. But in the case of a first generation, so in this case, the case of my kids, they were entitled to pass citizenship onto their kids. But not forever. And so the court suspended the application while we put through a law that actually, as Don Chapman said the other day, for once in its history made the Citizenship Act constitutional. It's just that it's been stalled throughout Parliament as we've tried to introduce. We've had a very difficult parliamentary session, Aaron. You've covered this. We had all parties agreeing that this should go forward except for the Conservatives. They have their reasons for it, for not putting it forward. But it is something I think that enfranchises people's constitutional rights, and it's something that we wanted to get right while making sure that we made a careful decision about deciding who gets to become Canadian and who doesn't. And so one of the tests of being Canadian was to make sure that anyone who was entitled to be Canadian, the person that was passing it on, had some substantial connection to Canada.
To the country, sure.
So 1,000 days in Canada, so that they could then pass it on to their kid, and it wasn't sort of something that got passed on till the end of time.
So in the case of Melanie, who's on the phone, I mean, she seems to have a reasonable claim here to suggest that she should be allowed to come back into the country, right?
Yeah, it sounds reasonable. I'd have to look at the facts of, she seems to have Melanie seems to have sides of both families that have Canadian connection. Obviously, a heart attached to Canada, but it's something that would have to be made not by me. The one missing element in this is that just before we were prorogued, or before the Parliament was dissolved, rather, I did instruct my department to put in a set of parameters so that while people were waiting, not only exigent circumstances could be looked at, but an attempt to try to mimic what the court would want, which is to make sure that people with that first generation cutoff were treated fairly and in a more equitable fashion. So that's currently what they're trying to put into place. The court is and will be looking at that as it suspends the application, as it continues or not to suspend the application of the decision. But it's something that's ongoing. The real cure to this, Aaron, is that we have to get back to Parliament and pass a law that makes sense.
All right. Well, there you go. Melanie, I don't know if that provides some hope or not, but at least, the governments are aware of it. I think all governments, all parties are aware of this. And as the minister said, that's the kind of thing that hopefully will get looked at once Parliament does resume. And that's only a matter of time. That's by the end of this month. I wish you the best, Melanie. I thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you, Minister Miller.